Cabins are meant to be escapes, places of peace. But every so often, peace is just a mask. The kind of place that feels untouched, forgotten, but maybe it's hiding more than we realize. What happened here? And why does it feel like someone or something never left? The very walls that are supposed to protect you start holding secrets you can't explain. The cabin you thought would be a quiet retreat starts to feel less like a sanctuary and more like a trap. What happens when a peaceful escape turns into a slow-brewing nightmare? Let's find out. I came to the cabin for peace, not to be bothered by anyone or anything. City life had worn me down. Endless deadlines, the constant rush of traffic, people always in your space. So when I found a listing for a long-term cabin rental in a quiet community, miles away from the nearest town, I jumped at the opportunity. It was just what I needed. The cabin itself was perfect. Nestled among towering pines, it was spacious enough for me, with a large window that overlooked a small, serene lake. The air smelled of pine and earth, a welcome change from the exhaust fumes I was used to inhaling. There was no internet, no phone service, just me and my thoughts, which I thought was exactly what I wanted. The days were blissful. I spent my mornings working on freelance projects, my afternoons hiking the nearby trails, and my evenings reading by the fire. There were a few other cabins dotted around the area, but I rarely saw anyone. Occasionally, I'd wave to a passing neighbor, but that was it. No small talk, no prying questions. Just solitude. Until I met Joe. I noticed him one evening as I was returning from a hike. He was standing by the edge of the woods, just off the path that led to his cabin. His place was a bit farther out, tucked into a darker, denser part of the forest. He wasn't much older than me, maybe mid-30s, though his eyes seemed older, harder. He wore a faded jacket, his hands shoved deep into the pockets, and he didn't smile when I waved. "Evening," I said, trying to be friendly. He nodded, his eyes never leaving mine. There was something disturbing about the way he looked at me, like he was sizing me up, studying me. It made my skin crawl, but I brushed it off. Maybe he was just the quiet type. The next few days, I noticed Joe more often. He seemed to always be around, just out of sight but close enough that I could feel his presence. I catch glimpses of him through the trees when I was out walking, or see the faint glow of a cigarette in the darkness near his cabin. He never approached me, never said a word, but I felt his eyes on me most times. At first, I told myself I was being paranoid. I come here for isolation, after all. But as the days passed, his presence became more unsettling. I started locking the cabin door, something I hadn't bothered with before. At night, I swore I could hear footsteps outside, the crunch of leaves just beyond my window. Then, things began to disappear. Small things at first, a lighter, a pair of gloves, my flashlight. I chalked it up to my own forgetfulness. But when my backpack vanished one afternoon, I knew something was wrong. I searched the cabin, turned everything upside down, but it was gone. The uneasy feeling that had been gnawing at me now grew into full-blown anxiety. I tried asking the locals about Joe, but no one would talk. I stopped by the nearest cabin, hoping for some insight, but the elderly couple living there just gave me blank stares when I mentioned his name. "Stay away from him," the old woman finally whispered. "Don't get involved." I left with more questions than answers. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the cabin seemed amplified, every rustle of leaves outside like a footstep. I woke up multiple times, drenched in sweat, convinced I'd heard someone moving around outside. But each time, when I peered out the window, there was nothing but darkness. On the fifth night, the power went out, plunging the cabin into complete darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, only to remember it had gone missing. I grabbed my phone, using its weak glow to find my way to the kitchen where I'd stashed some candles. That's when I saw the figure outside. Joe. He was standing just beyond the trees, staring directly at me through the window. He didn't move, didn't blink, just watched. I backed away slowly, the phone shaking in my hand. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. I froze. The sound was so deliberate, so calm. Another knock, even more amplified this time. I didn't move. My mind raced. Why would Joe be knocking? Why not just walk away like he always did? Something about this felt different, more threatening. I edged toward the door, heart pounding, and called out, "Who's there?" Nothing. Then a voice low, almost mocking. "I found your backpack." My blood ran cold. How the hell did he get it? I hadn't seen him anywhere near my cabin when it disappeared. "I'll leave it right here," the voice continued, too casual, like he was doing me a favor. There was a heavy thud, something dropping onto the wooden porch. I stood frozen, listening to the sound of his footsteps retreating into the night. I was skeptical at first, minutes passed feeling like hours. I finally worked up the courage to open the door. There it was, my backpack, right where he said he'd leave it. But something about the bag didn't resonate with me. It felt wrong, too perfect. It was dry. Even though it had rained the night it disappeared. The zipper was slightly open, like someone had rifled through it. I hesitated, then reached down and unzipped it fully. Inside was a set of clothes. Not mine, someone else's. A jacket, jeans, and a blood-stained shirt. Panic clawed at my throat. I staggered back. That's when I noticed a small notebook tucked into the side pocket. I pulled it out fearfully and flipped through the pages. It was Joe's. Detailed entries, dates, names, people, cabin residents. He had been watching them, following them. One by one, they disappeared from the community. The last entry had today's date. Daniel, cabin 5, tonight. My blood ran cold. I didn't wait to see what came next. I grabbed my keys and bolted to my car, peeling out of the driveway without looking back. As the cabin disappeared in the rearview mirror, a horrible realization settled in. Joe hadn't just been watching me. He'd been planning for me. And now he is probably waiting for his next victim. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend, a chance for us to patch things up, to finally talk like we used to. My parents, my brother, and I hadn't spent real time together in years. When my mom suggested a family retreat to a cabin she'd found online, I agreed without much thought. It was supposed to be about healing, meditation, and just spend some quality time with my family from the rush city life. The cabin itself wasn't what I had expected. It was bigger, older, and the lake it sat by was more of a dark, stagnant pond. The trees were dense, blocking most of the daylight, casting a permanent shadow over the entire area. It felt claustrophobic. I tried not to let it bother me, telling myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place. But the tension between us, the family, didn't help. My brother, Jake, was glued to his phone, barely acknowledging anyone. Dad kept fiddling with the cabin's rusty generator, grumbling about the not-so-promising lights. And Mom seemed oddly distracted. She was always the one holding us together, but this time, her distant, almost vacant demeanor unnerved me. As night fell, as we sat around the fire, the conversation was strained. The flickering flames casted distorted shadows on the cabin walls, making everything feel smaller, more confined. I tried to spark meaningful conversation, asking about Jake's job or Dad's retirement plans, but they responded with short, clipped answers, as if they weren't really present. It wasn't until I mentioned the cabin that I noticed the shift. "Mom, where did you say you found this place?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She paused, staring into the fire. "A friend recommended it." "What friend?" I pressed on, confused. My mom wasn't exactly the social butterfly. She didn't answer. Her eyes flicked toward the cabin's dark windows, then back to the fire. The silence grew uncomfortable, but before I could push further, Dad stood up abruptly, muttering something about needing to check the generator again. Jake followed. disappearing into his room without a word. Left alone with my mom, I noticed something strange. Her posture was rigid, her fingers gripping the arms of the chair too tightly. I watched as her eyes darted to the cabin windows again, and I wanted to talk to her, but felt not to, as she was acting too weird from the moment I've entered the cabin. I sneaked out from there and went to my room. I didn't sleep much that night. The wind howled through the trees, rattling the windows, and I kept waking to strange sounds. But it was the silence that unsettled me the most. The kind of silence that felt alive. The next morning, things only got worse. Jake was nowhere to be found, and when I asked Mom about it, she brushed it off as if it were no big deal. He probably went for a walk, she said with a dismissive wave, though there was something hollow in her tone. Hours passed, and my unease grew sitting inside the cabin. I went searching the woods, calling his name, but the deeper I went, the more distorted I became. I called out multiple times, but the thick trees muffled my voice, swallowing it whole. I returned to the cabin, only to find my dad staring blankly at the lake, completely unresponsive. When I shook his shoulder, his eyes locked onto mine, but there was no recognition there, just a cold, empty stare. I panicked, running back inside to find my mom sitting at the table, flipping through a photo album I hadn't seen before. The photos were old, sepia-toned images of another family. But what froze my blood was how much they looked like us. A mother, father, son, and daughter. The resemblance was uncanny. "Mom, what is this?" I asked with a shaky voice. She looked up at me with a calm, eerie smile. "We're just like them," she whispered. I found Jake later that evening. He was sitting on the porch, staring into the woods, his eyes as blank as the family in the photo. When I shook him, he didn't react. He didn't even seem to see me. And that's when I realized this wasn't a reunion. It was a replacement. We weren't here to fix our family. We were here to become something else. When I first saw the listing for the caretaker position, it seemed like fate. I had just been laid off from a company I'd given 15 years of my life to, and now at 43, I was at a loss. The cabin was isolated, tucked away in the mountains, offering me a few months of solitude in exchange for basic upkeep and repairs. It sounded perfect, an escape from the crushing weight of failure. The only contact I'd have would be with a nearby town, a small place with a population so tiny, I imagined it practically ran itself. The drive up was peaceful, a winding road through dense woods. The cabin itself sat alone on a ridge, overlooking nothing but an expanse of trees and the gloomy sky beyond. It looked older than I expected, though not run down, just neglected. The windows were smeared with dirt, and there was a thin layer of dust on the porch railings. Nothing out of the ordinary, I told myself. A place like this wouldn't be occupied often. My first night passed quietly enough, though I woke up several times to the sound of wind rattling the window frames. Or at least, I thought it was the wind. The next day, as I was cleaning up, I found a cracked window in the living room, but something about it didn't sit right with me. The break looked recent, the glass sharp and jagged on the inside, not as though a branch had fallen from the outside. I brushed it aside and went to the town for a walk. The town was small, just a few shops and a single bar, but the people were warm and friendly, quick to strike up conversation when they saw a new face. Still, when I asked about the cabin's history, the conversations grew shorter. Nothing much to tell, they said. It's just been there. That was the first thing that unsettled me, the way the townspeople grew evasive when the subject came up. Like they knew something they weren't telling me. Over the next few weeks, I started to notice more small things. The odd creaks at night became a pattern. A consistent rhythm, like footsteps, always stopping just outside my door. I convinced myself it was just the age of the cabin, the way old wood settles, but it gnawed at me. One night, I heard what sounded like a faint voice, like two people talking outside the cabin, whispering in a very hushed voice. I got up and checked outside in the whole house just to be sure, but there was no one there. It was on a particularly restless night that I found a notebook tucked away in a drawer of the old desk in the study. They were written by previous caretakers, I believe, though their entries were sparse. But what was there, those few lines, were unsettling. References to strange dreams, to feeling watched. One caretaker wrote about finding small things out of place, similar to what I had. Another mentioned vivid nightmares that felt too real, waking up in a cold sweat with a distinct feeling of someone staring at you. As the days dragged on, the isolation weighed on me. I began to have dreams, two strange ones. In them, I wasn't alone in the cabin. There was always a shadow in the corner of my vision, watching, but whenever I turned, it vanished. When I returned to town, the friendly demeanor of the townspeople felt forced, like they were hiding something from me. Their eyes lingered on me just a bit too long. It felt like I was an outsider, not just because I was new, but because I was staying in that cabin. One night at the bar, I overheard whispers about the cabin, hushed voices discussing what happened the last time. The tipping point came on a stormy night. The wind howled, and the cabin groaned under the pressure. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to ignore the familiar sound of footsteps creeping outside my door. Suddenly, I heard whispers like what I heard a few nights ago. But this time, it wasn't faint. It was as if someone was standing right beside me, whispering my name. I shot up, heart pounding, and rushed to the door, yanking it open. There was no one there. Again checked the whole cabin as I was getting restless by these things happening around me, without knowing if they were actually happening or am I imagining things. I again brushed it aside and was going back to bed, but at the end of the hallway, I noticed something I hadn't before, an old worn rug. Something about it seemed out of place. I moved it aside, revealing a trapdoor I hadn't noticed before. My hands trembled as I pulled it open, revealing a set of stairs leading down into darkness. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to stop, but I couldn't help myself. I descended, my flashlight barely cutting through the thick gloom. At the bottom, I found a small room, cramped and cold. The air was thick, stale, and in the center of the room stood a crude table. On it were items I couldn't explain, faded photographs of people I didn't recognize, strange carvings, and objects that looked ritualistic. My breath hitched when I saw an old, dust-covered notebook. It was similar to the one I found inside the drawer, but far older. As I flipped through its pages, the entries grew more erratic, the handwriting more frantic. Words like sacrifice and blood were scrawled across the margins, though the last entry stopped mid-sentence. I threw it all as it is and ran upstairs. I fled the cabin the next morning, not even bothering to pack. The last thing I saw as I sped away was the townspeople watching me from their porches. Even now, I don't know what I found in that cabin, but something tells me the locals knew more than I could ever know.